everyone. Thank you for joining us this month for this month's ASM Ontario talk. I'm really excited for this one, and I'm glad that you were able to join. So here again, Abdallah Al Sayed with the other executives at ASM Ontario. And I want to thank Jordan, Mernali, our question master, Danielle, as well as our speaker, Greg, for helping to put this together this event. Thanks for all of you who are here to attend. You should be only able to see your name in the attendees list and then the panelists as well as our videos. If you want to hear about future events, please sign up to our mailing list, and then always check back ASM Ontario for videos from previous talks as well as upcoming talks. Now I'll pass it on to Jordan, who will introduce our speaker.
Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. As you know, today we are here for the hottest ASM world-class speaker talk to date, and I do mean that literally. So parts of fusion reactors can reach temperatures in the millions of degrees Celsius. We're talking 10 times hotter than the sun and thousands of times hotter than the temperatures that a rocket ship would face returning to Earth. It is really almost difficult to fathom just how hot that really is and how a heat that powerful can be contained. Nuclear fusion is one of the few environmentally friendly sources of energy that doesn't contribute greenhouse gases, and the heat it generates doesn't even contribute to global warming. That's not to say nuclear fusion doesn't have its downsides, because we all know the damage these reactors can do if something goes seriously wrong. And that's why engineering every part of these reactors is such an important task. Today, our speaker comes to us from France, where approximately 70% of the electricity that powers his connection to us is from nuclear fusion. Here to tell us some of the challenges material science is addressing to make nuclear fusion safe is Dr. Greg de Temmerman.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm very happy to be able to give you another side of the field I'm working in. We'll talk about something which is actually very hot, 150 million degrees, and we are going to try and I'm going to try and explain to you what we face as challenges when we try to design materials which have to go inside the vessel close to a plasma which is so hot. And that's one of the most pressing issues in making nuclear fusion work. You might know that there is no fusion reactors in the world right now working. We are working on it. People have been working on it for about 70 years, so it's a pretty long quest. We hope to get closer to getting electricity out of fusion, but it's still a far-fetched. However, fusion does work. We all know that, hopefully, because if you look outside, I don't know how the weather is at your place, but if you look outside, there should be a yellow thing in the sky. And that's actually a fusion reactor, which has been burning for about 4.5 billion years, and which probably has the same amount of time still to burn. And if you were to look very, very close inside the sun, what you would see is actually particle fusing. The sun typically fuses about 640 million tons of hydrogen every second, generating every second 1 million times more energy than we consume on Earth every year. So there's a lot of energy which is actually created by the sun, and everything is actually from fusion. And remember that actually all the atoms in the universe, or most of them, are actually created through fusion. So what is fusion? Fusion is in principle the opposite of the fission process that we all know, especially in France, because 70% of our electricity comes from nuclear fission. So in fission, you take a big atom and you split it. When it splits, it emits lighter particles and mainly neutrons. Those neutrons are used to actually heat water. You generate steam and then electricity. Fusion is the opposite. What you try to do is to take two small atoms. You have to take very small atoms, and we'll discuss why later on. So in the case of what we are trying to do on Earth, we try to take isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium, which has 1 neutron, one proton, and tritium, which has 2 neutrons and 1 proton. You put them very close together so that they fuse, so they form a new particle, and then finally form a helium atom, which is basically inert, so it doesn't do anything. And then a neutron, which is highly energetic and which will then heat the walls around the fusion process, and then boil water or boil a gas, and then generate electricity. So in principle, making fusion is quite easy, and the process you use is actually the fact that the mass of what you form, so the neutron and the helium particle, is has a slightly different mass than what you started with, the deuterium and tritium. As a pretty obscure German physicist said quite back in the day, there is an equivalence between the mass you have actually converted and energy which you generate. So basically you have a small mass difference between the products and the reactants, and this mass is actually converted into energy. And the advantage is because you have such a relationship with the square of a light speed, a little mass difference generates a lot of energy. So we have a very high energy density to start with. And in principle, doing fusion is actually quite easy. You need, and that's the only equation I'll be showing, so I apologize for that. But in order to have a burning plasma, so a plasma which is actually producing energy, so we'll talk about what a plasma is, but basically for a fusion reactor to actually produce energy, you need the product of the density, so the number of particles in a given volume, multiplied by the temperature, multiplied by the confinement time, which is basically how good we are at isolating this very hot gas from the outside. And if the product of those three values or constants is actually higher than a given value, then we create energy through fusion. So the density is to make sure that you have enough particles which can react. So you have to have a certain number of particles in a certain volume. In what I will be talking about, we have actually very low densities. So we have densities which are typically 1,000,000 times or even more lower than the density of the air in the room where you are. So we work at very low density, but we work at very high temperature. The temperatures we have to reach on Earth for deuterium and tritium to fuse is typically in the order of 150 million degrees, which is 10 times higher than the temperature inside the core of the sun. Why do we have to go and at those kind of temperatures? Is because when you try to fuse particles, if you remember a bit about chemistry or particle physics, you basically have a charged nucleus. So the nucleus is positively charged with an electron spinning around. If you remove the electrons, you still have two positively charged particles, which you are trying to put very close together because you want them to fuse. So you have to have the particles getting close enough together for the strong interaction force to act and then to fuse the particles. And that can only happen if you are able to go above the repulsion force that you have between the positively charged particles. And the way to do that is to have collisions at very high energy. And because we work in a gas you have an equivalence between the temperature and the speed at which the particles move. So the hotter we get, the faster the particles move, and the more probability we have to have a high energy collision. And then the confinement time is a measure of the efficiency at which we are actually confining that gas somewhere and it does not leak energy. So you have to make sure that it's sufficiently isolated from the outside so that it can stay hot and can have fusion reactions inside it. So when you see that, because it's a product, you could in principle have different recipes to do fusion. And there are two main ways to do it. There's the so-called inertial fusion way, where you use high power lasers to compress deuterium and tritium. You have a very low confinement time in the microsecond range, even much less. You have extremely high density. They use densities typically 1,000,000 times higher than the density of lead. And they use relatively high temperature still. In what I will be discussing, we use the opposite approach, which is we use very low densities, much lower than that. So typically, again, 1,000,000 or 10,000,000 times lower than the density of air. We use high temperatures again, and we use relatively long confinement time. So confinement time for a plasma physicist, or long confinement time would be in the order of seconds, right? For us, it's already quite a lot. But if we can get those parameters right, then we get fusion to actually happen. Fusion is very interesting for many reasons. First of all, it's safe because it's so hard to make fusion to happen. It cannot run away by itself. So if anything goes wrong, the reaction just stops by itself in a few hundred milliseconds. And there is no risk of any runaway or meltdown because you just you don't have the energy. The big difference between fission and fusion is that fission you have to moderate all the time. You try to control the neutrons and make sure they do what you want. In fusion, you have to actually make the conditions for the reaction to happen. It's extremely difficult, and that means any disturbance in the reaction will just stop it directly. One interesting thing also is that, and that's true, of course, for any nuclear process, but fusion is even better, is you have a very high energy density. So 1 kilo of fuel or 1 gram of fuel has a lot of energy compared to what you would have with gasoline. So if we look at the amount of fuel we will need to power 1 million of modern humans, I think they are Europeans, but that should not change too much from Canadians. you will need about 400 kilos of deuterium tritium, about 4 tons of uranium or thorium, and then you will need 6.4 billion kilos of gasoline. So you see the energy density you have in nuclear fuel is really high. And then the last advantage of fusion is that it doesn't create the long-lived waste, which is posing so many issues everywhere. It does create waste because it's a nuclear process, but typically after 100, 200 years, you could go inside the reactor and start dismantling it. And you don't need to store waste for a very long amount of time, which makes it easier to actually handle. Now, when you heat a gas at about 150 million degrees, it's not really a gas anymore. It's what we call a plasma. And typically, a plasma is what we call the fourth state of matter. So we all know what happens when you have a solid and you heat it, you have a liquid. I can take the analogy with ice. If I continue heating, I do have a gas, so water vapor in this case. If I continue bringing energy to the gas, what happens at some point is that the electrons can start become free, so they can separate from the nuclei. And then I have a soup, which is basically a gas at the same density, but where the charged particles can actually move from each other, independently from each other. Well, not totally independently, but they are still free to move. So now you have a fluid which has positive and negative charges. It's still neutral, electrically speaking, because you have as many positive charges as negative charges. But it's very interesting because it can react to electric currents and also magnetic and electric fields. And that's what we will be using to actually confine the plasma. And you can see, of course, a lot of manifestations of plasmas even on Earth, and about more than 95% of the matter in the universe is actually in the form of plasma. Now, basically, a fusion reactor is a vessel in which you inject gas, you heat that gas at 150 million degrees, you bring enough particles, you confine that gas so that you reach the right conditions, and then it starts burning and generate energy. Now, if I was telling you that my plan, and I would need some money from you, my plan is to heat something at 150 million degrees, put it in a metallic box and try to generate energy out of that, it might be it might not be impossible, but you think I'm totally crazy. And the trick with fusion is actually to make sure we can isolate this very hot plasma from the surrounding materials for many reasons. First of all, it will damage the materials because no material can actually sustain the conditions we have inside. But also it will cool down the plasma because it would add, so you basically melt the surfaces, you bring atoms from the metal inside the plasma, it cools it down, it dilutes it, so it will never work that way. So we have to find a way to actually confine the plasma so that it doesn't touch the wall, or it minimizes the contact between the plasma and the wall. And we do that by using magnetic confinement. As I told you, we use charged particles, so we have ions and electrons basically. And if I put, if I take the example of a cylinder, I heat, so it's like a gas tube, for example, those that we were using for lightning at some point. So you take a gas tube, you have a current inside it, or you heat it, you create a plasma, so you have charged particles which are then free to move. If I apply a magnetic field in this direction, so in the direction of a cylinder, what happens is that the particles can only rotate around the field lines, basically. You all learned about that in principle in your physics studies, so it might be bad memories. So the two things that particles can do is just move along the magnetic field and then rotate around the magnetic field lines, but they are frozen along those directions. They in principle cannot diffuse out in the radial direction. Of course, you can have collisions. So if I do that, I have already a way to make sure my plasma is not touching the wall, because I can squeeze it with a magnetic field and make sure I confine it that way. Of course, if I have a tube like that, what happens is that I have losses at both ends, because particles will just travel, so they will touch the end of my tube. My tube cannot be infinitely long, so I have an issue. The confinement will never be good enough. Now, a physicist is in principle smarter than a plasma, so we figured out that issue quite early on in fusion, and we decided that the best configuration was actually to fold the tube on itself in the form of a donut, of a torus, basically, because in that way, if I can have a magnetic field which is going along the torus, the particles can move in that direction. They cannot move radially because I confine them, I pinch them with my field. And then there is no end of this tube. It has to go around and around. And that's the principle of what we call the tokamak, which is a magnetic confinement device, which is using powerful magnets to actually confine the plasma. The tokamak concept has been invented in Russia in the 60s. So it's a Russian acronym. I won't make any insult to anybody in trying to say that. But basically, this means toroidal chamber with the magnetic coils. And the principle is we have those big blue coils, which have a shape of a D, which are going around the torus. They generate what we call the toroidal magnetic field, which is going in the direction of the torus. So as I showed you before, if you fold the tube and then put magnets around, this is how it would look like. Now, if I only had those blue coils, basically, if you remember your physics lessons, and I apologize about that, but the magnetic field will be stronger in the center than at the edge, that going outside. So I would have a gradient of a magnetic field. The magnetic field will vary with the radius, which means that the particles will spend more time inside than outside, and I will create instabilities. Basically, particles will be drifting in one direction for the positively charged particles, in another direction for the negatively charged particles. So the plasma will never be stable. I need actually a second magnetic field to help me compensate for the drifts. And that I will do by using the fact the plasma conducts electricity. You have to think of a plasma at 150 million degrees as a copper wire. It has the same electrical conductivity. So what I can do is I can use the induction effect. So I put a coil inside my torus. So this green coil here, which we call a central solenoid. I vary the current inside this solenoid as a function of time, and I have basically a transformer now. This is the primary of my transformer. The secondary will be the plasma itself. By varying the current inside the solenoid, I create a current inside the plasma by induction. By induction again, this electrical current creates a magnetic field which is going around the plasma, so in that direction, in the direction of those green arrows. And now I have a combination of the field going around the torus and then here around the plasma. And when I do that, this is basically the kind of magnetic geometry I have. So the field lines are twisted on themselves so that I can compensate the time the particles spend inside the machine and outside of the machine. And by doing that, I can now control the plasma and I can now confine it for long enough. So typically, we like to say that a tokamak is like a donut in terms of geometry, but really you should think of it as a twisted element where the plasma has to go around the torus, but also around itself, twisting around itself so that we create a stable configuration. Now, as I said, fusion has been going on for about 70 years, and the big joke about fusion is 30 years away and will always be. And unfortunately, the reason for it to be almost true is because fusion is incredibly hard. And so far, we never managed to create energy from fusion. So we managed to have fusion reactions to confine a plasma at really high temperatures. We even went up to 500 million degrees in the 90s. So we can reach all the conditions, but not at one place at one time, so that we never managed to create energy with fusion. And you have to remember that to have fusion reactions, I need to eat something at 150 million degrees, which means I need to add power to it. So I need to add power to the system. And if I want to get energy out, I basically need to make sure that I create more energy from the process that I need to inject into the process itself. So you should think of fusion reactor as a power amplifier. I put some power in and I want to get much more power out typically. And then the machine which is supposed to demonstrate that is what we call ITER, which is a big scientific project going on in the south of France, near Marseille or Aix-en-Provence, if you know. And this is typically the size the machine will have. It's about 30 meters in diameter and 29 meters in height. So it's a pretty big baby. The plasma volume is about 1,000 cubic meters, and it's supposed to demonstrate that we can control a fusion plasma and we can generate 10 times more energy out of the fusion process than we inject into the plasma. So just give you some numbers. The aim of ITER is to produce 500 megawatts of fusion power. So this is thermal power. ITER will not generate electricity. It only generates heat, and we have cooling around, so we basically dump that heat into water. But we don't do anything out of it. And then we inject about, the aim is to inject about 50 megawatts, so you have a ratio of about 10 between both values. Now, as I said, one of the big challenge in fusion is to actually control the heat and make sure materials can actually handle the heat. So I will just guide you through the problem of power exhaust. So how much power do we have to exhaust, and what kind of power fluxes the materials have to face? So if I take the geometry of a tokamak with a magnetic field going that way, so we give it a special shape. I won't go into the details. I create about 500 megawatts of fusion power with ITER. 400 megawatts is in the form of neutrons. 80% of the reaction, of the energy of the reaction, is actually in the form of neutrons. Those neutrons are not charged, so they get out of the plasma and they just deposit that energy around the machine. So that's fine. It's a volumetric process. It doesn't put much heat onto the components. Typically, in a fusion reactor, you would have half a megawatt per square meter in terms of volumetric heat, so it's not that much. In terms of helium particles, they are charged. So those helium particles carry 20% of the reaction, which is about 100 megawatts in this case, and they stay in the plasma because they are charged, so they are confined by the plasma. We actually use them to heat the plasma. So the plasma is basically self-heated. But basically that means I have about 100 megawatts of power, which is inside the plasma, plus the 50 megawatts that I actually put in. And because of the magnetic geometry, the power is going to be deposited in a very narrow region, because when particles come out of the plasma, they move extremely fast along the magnetic field, but of course very slowly across the magnetic field, because the field is extremely strong in a tokamak. So when they follow the field lines and when they deposit their energy at the bottom of the machine, we only have a very small area inside the machine where the power is deposited. So if you take ITER, you have about 700 square meters of surface inside, but the power is only deposited on about 2.4 square meters. So if you do the math, I have about 40 megawatts per square meter to exhaust in this area, which is a lot for a material. And actually no component or no material can actually take that. Another problem with fusion is that the area I have to deposit the energy only scales with a major radius. So when I make a machine bigger, I gain a little bit. So the area on which I can deposit the power is proportional to the major radius of the machine. But the stored energy, so the energy I have to dissipate, actually scales with a power of typically 4 to 5 to the radius. So as I make those machines bigger, and ITER is much bigger than the machines we had before, then the amount of energy we get is much higher, which is good, but I don't have so much surface area on which to deposit them. Now, we can do some tricks in trying to extinguish a bit of the plasma before it comes to the surface, but we still have to deal with extremely high heat fluxes, and I will detail that in the next slide. Both steady states of the machine is supposed to run for a long amount of time at long durations at a time. But as we will see, there are also a lot of instabilities which are increasing the heat fluxes by 3 orders of magnitude at least in the order of a millisecond duration, and you do that at 100 Hertz, basically 100 times a second. But this is not only heat, these are particles, so the heat is carried out by charged particles. So we continuously have a bombardment of energetic particles onto the surfaces, and this has a lot of effect on how the materials can actually cope with that. Just to put things into perspective, if I take the heat flux that a re-entry vehicle is actually having when it enters into the Earth's atmosphere, you typically are around 1 megawatts per square meter, so you deposit 1 megawatt of power on each square meter of surfaces. In the divertor of a tokamak, you typically are 10-20 times higher than that, with 10-20 megawatts per square meter. At the surface of the sun, really, you would have about 65 megawatts per square meter. So you see that we are actually extremely hot. It's really like trying to put a material on the surface of the sun. To get higher heat fluxes in technologies, you need either to look at arc welding, for example, where you have very high localized heat fluxes. Or if you look in the engines of a rocket, you typically go in the 80 to 100 megawatts per square meter, but for a very short amount of time. And for ITER, ITER is a project of about 20 billion euros. But the pieces inside are going to have to live for about 10 years. So you have to deal with that heat for very long durations. And during instabilities, there is basically no equivalent. So the only equivalence you can find is if you think of a black smoker, eruptions under the sea. But you typically don't have to deal with that. Another thing is that you have high fluxes of particles hitting your surfaces all the time, and typically in a tokamak, those fluxes are 1, 2, 3 orders of magnitude higher than any kind of plasma processes we have in the world. So we typically are driving surfaces into a regime which we don't know much about because we have so many particles bombarding the surfaces continuously. And typically you are actually out of equilibrium because you try to put a lot of gas particles inside your surface, and you are exceeding any kind of solubility of, or you're actually saturating all of your surfaces. And because ITER is a unique machine which will work for a very long amount of time, the total number of particles we have also as a function of time is orders of magnitude higher than whatever we ever made in the lab. So when we go to a fusion reactor, we are basically going into an uncharted territory as far as the materials go. Another thing which, okay, now you have the materials issues by themselves. So what happens in the bulk of the material? I said that particles are bombarding this material all the time. But what happens also is you're actually eroding the surface. So you're removing continuously atoms from your surfaces, which are basically, so your material is thinning as a function of time. I won't go too much into the details, but typically, typically what happens if you look at the cross section of ITER is that the particles will bombard everywhere. They remove particles here. Those particles get ionized. They get transported by and through the plasma, so they circulate inside the machine, and then they end up being deposited somewhere else. So typically you would have an area on which you are removing atoms all the time, and then those atoms are going somewhere else, either in the divertor or close to where they originated from. If you look at a reactor, you could have millimeters per year of erosion. So you have to make sure that you have enough thickness for your material to actually live long enough. But this thickness cannot be infinitely large because you need cooling at the back. You have high heat fluxes, so you have to find a balance between how much erosion you have, how much thickness you can have, how much cooling you want, and this is pretty tricky engineering. Basically, there is a continuous migration of materials inside the plasma. You erode atoms, they get transported, they get deposited, they get re-eroded from somewhere, they get retransported, and then it's a continuous cycle. So if I look at the conditions the material has to face in the fusion reactors, I have 4 components. I have the high energy neutrons. The neutrons in the fusion reactors will typically be at the 14 MeV energy, which is 10 times higher than energy in a fission reactor. So we have a lot of neutrons, we have high fluxes, but they are extremely energetic, which is creating a lot of transmutation. It's creating hydrogen and helium into the material. It's modifying its thermal conductivity. It's also changing its composition. We have high heat fluxes, so I have to have a material which is resistant to high heat. I have the plasma particles, we'll talk about that. So continuously I'm putting particles inside the lattice of the material. So this is putting it under a lot of stress, and there are a lot of dynamic effects. And I have this issue of erosion and deposition. So the composition of the material will change because I have different materials around, and I will get a continuous mixing, which means I can have in some cases alloying. So I start with a pure material, but I end up with an alloy under a certain thickness, which is changing the parameters or the properties. If I take, if I think in terms of project and I say, okay, what are the requirements I want for a material to put in a fusion reactor? Well, it's a pretty long list. I want a high heat conductivity, a high melting point, large thermal shock resistant. I want it to be machinable. I want it to not degrade too much in terms of thermophysical properties. I want it to not activate too much, otherwise I will create waste. I don't want to retain too much tritium because tritium is actually quite precious, and actually Canada is supplying tritium, will be supplying tritium to ITER at some point. I want it to be resistant to erosion because if my material erodes too fast, I have a lifetime issue. I want also to be resistant to local effects. We can have a lot of electric arcing, hotspots, and so on. And I want that if the atoms are penetrating into the hot plasma, they should not contaminate the plasma too much. So when you look at this list and you try to think, why is there a material which is actually ticking all boxes? Well, the answer is no. So you have to make do with whatever you can and choose which parameters you actually optimize and how you can find a compromise between the plasma and the material. If I look back in time, how things happened, very early on, the first tokamaks and the first fusion devices were built with glass walls. You might wonder why, but it's because glass was actually easy to manufacture in different shapes. You see a first example of a machine. So there is no scale, but it's about a meter across. And you see that this is basically a glass tube, and you see the magnetic coils around. Now, pretty quickly, people realized that glass was really bad because it's electrically insulating and you have a plasma inside, and you actually need for stabilization conducting surface. Insulators don't work too well when you have a plasma, you tend to have arcing and so on. So people moved quickly to stainless steel. Stainless steel is very good, but you always have hydrogen inside steel. And then that was an issue because it was basically you were degassing the steel inside the plasma. I should have said that we work in vacuum, in really high vacuum actually, when we make a plasma. So we have to have very clean surfaces, and stainless steel at that time was not ideal. Then people decided to use different kind of structures to isolate the vacuum vessel from the material itself, which was in contact into the plasma. And at that time, people said, well, we want a material which is as resistant to as possible, which has a very high melting point. So when you look at this plot, looking at the melting point of different metals, well, the king is tungsten. Basically, it melts at 3,422 degrees Celsius. So that's the better choice to go to. That's the most resistant metal, pure metal that you can actually find. And then it became used quite a lot, but there was already an issue very easily found, is that tungsten is very heavy. It has a lot of electrons, so when it penetrates inside the plasma, it does radiate a lot of the energy. And what we noticed is, or what they noticed at the time, I was not born, but the plasma was actually cooled down at extremely low temperature inside the core, and basically fusion would never happen like that. So tungsten was resistant, but we could not make it work in that way. Impurities would just accumulate inside the plasma. Then people started to look at whatever material they could find and to try them. So if I take a list basically into the periodical classification and I look at it, I'm pretty sure somebody tried it in a tokamak at some point. So a non-exhaustive list will be stainless steel, molybdenum in MIT, in Boston, close to where you are, I think. Tungsten, as I said, aluminium, alumina, boron carbide, beryllium, I will talk about it. Gold, my favorite. People actually, as you see an inside view of the Ormac tokamak in Oak Ridge in the US, and you see those gold-plated plates everywhere. You might wonder, well, those fusion people are rich because they put gold into their machine. The thinking at the time was gold is pretty heavy, so it should not sputter too much, but more importantly, it should be very good for vacuum because it doesn't react with impurities, oxygen and hydrogen and so on. So it should be very good for maintaining a high vacuum and at the same time not contaminate the plasma too much. Well, it turned out it didn't work so well. And actually it's pretty good. It's probably a good thing because I don't think anybody could manage to get enough gold to build a tokamak. Titanium, lithium were used, titanium carbide, titanium diboride, copper, carbon. And actually carbon was a turning point, was a revolution for fusion. What happened at some point is that graphite, reactor grade, fine grain graphite became available. Carbon is very good because it has a low atomic number. It has a very good thermal conductivity. Isotropic, it's isotropic when you use it in the form of fine grain graphite. It has a limited strength, but we can do with that. But most importantly for fusion, it doesn't melt. So carbon or graphite sublimates. So if there is too much heat, you create a carbon vapor, but you don't go into a liquid phase. And that's very important because that means your material is extremely resistant to heat. Yes, you can have a big vaporization of carbon, but it maintains its shape, and that's very important. And as soon as people switch from tungsten to carbon, then performances of devices doubled, they reach much higher temperatures, and fusion make a lot of progress. And you can see here a tokamak which was built in the 90s, which is fully armored with graphite tiles. People even looked at CFC, carbon fiber composite, because it has a better strength, and you can basically engineer the fibers to increase the thermal conductivity. Some people went even more exotic. I led a project at some point to look at diamond. Why diamond? Is because, well, if you like carbon, graphite is great, but diamond has the best thermal conductivity of all known materials. Of course, doesn't come cheap. But we had a project with a company to actually produce thick artificial diamond, which was doped with boron, and we tried that, and it has a world record in terms of thermal shock resistance of any material ever tested. So it was pretty good, but it's too complicated to make, and you don't get the throughput, and it's also a bit sensitive to neutrons. And then people said also, well, if one issue we have is that our metal is going to melt, why not use a liquid metal to start with? Because then I don't have to worry about the shape and the melting, it's already melted. And in that vein, people looked a lot at lithium because it melts at really low temperature. And then an advantage also is because the liquid is flowing, you can basically use it to remove heat more efficiently. So you have more heat carrying capacity, and it's quite efficient. The problem is lithium is very reactive. For those who know, for example, liquid lithium will just eat through copper like nothing. So when you have a nuclear facility, when you have water cooling everywhere, lithium reacts a lot with air and water, so it poses some issues. Now, ITER has taken a different approach, which is to use beryllium inside the main chamber. So you have about 640 square meters of beryllium. These are all of those panels that you have. And those panels have very complicated shapes, and we'll discuss that later on. But typically, each panel is about 1 meter by 1.4 meter. It's about 50 centimeters, sorry, because you need a thick steel plate behind it to actually absorb neutrons and slow down neutrons. Remember that you have a plasma at 150 million degrees here in the center of the machine, and about 2.45 meters away, you have a magnetic coil, which is cooled at 4 degrees Kelvin to be superconducting. So you have extremely high temperature gradient, and you should avoid that any neutrons actually going into the coils, because that will heat them and they will not be superconducting anymore. And what you also might see is that all those panels are actually segmented. So there are small blocks of beryllium braced next to each other, and that's to actually accommodate for thermal expansion and to avoid the formation of large cracks, because you have a lot of thermal gradients, so components tend to deform. And in order to make sure that the beryllium armor is holding, you basically segment everything. For the divertor, people use tungsten, so you might think, oh, you say tungsten doesn't work. Well, it works when we have a divertor for different reasons. I won't go into the detail. And ITER will be using a very sophisticated piece of tungsten, which is made of 54 individual cassettes. Each cassette is actually weighing 8 tons. It's actively cooled. It's designed to handle a total power of 100 megawatts, so this is a pretty impressive beast. And the body of it, so on which it is fixed, is made of stainless steel. It's a special variant of 316L because we need low nitrogen content, because nitrogen tends to activate. And what you might notice is that the divertor is made of very small blocks again, and you have about 250,000 of those blocks. Typically, they are 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters by 12 millimeters. So this is very small pieces. They are brazed onto, I don't have it here. They are brazed onto a copper tube. So you have a copper tube which is going that direction, and those blocks have a hole, and then they are brazed onto the structure. So this is a lot of engineering. And one thing which is very important is alignment. What we want to avoid, so the plasma is flowing along the magnetic field lines. What we want to avoid is that because we have finite components, we have gaps in between. So you can have disalignment or misalignment between the different components. And we want to avoid that a feed line can actually penetrate and see an edge and not go and smooth on a smooth surface. If you do that, basically you have all of the plasma power on a very tiny area at normal incidence, and you would melt basically anything you have. So you have to make sure you hide all of those edges by actually tilting the different components. So each of those cassettes is actually tilted by a degree or so compared to its neighbor, because then you create a natural protection. So alignment is extremely critical. But even more, when you go at the level of the monoblocks, so these are those tubes that I showed you, each of those monoblocks has to be beveled with a 0.5 millimeter height difference between one side and the other. So this is strongly exaggerated here, but for the same reason, so that all of the blocks have their edges protected. So you can never have a plasma penetrating inside a gap at normal incidence. So the tolerance for such a piece is about 0.3 millimeter in that direction. So you have to have a very precise alignment, and then you shape the surface of all those blocks to actually protect the leading edges. Now, you pay a price, because when you tilt those things, you can see it here, part of the surface will not be wetted by the plasma anymore. So you reduce the area on which you can deposit the surface, which means you drive the temperature up. And typically you see that we can get up to 1300 degrees in normal operation, and you have a very strong thermal gradient also. For two reasons: you are using a square block and a round tube, so you naturally have more cooling in the center than at the edge. But because you tilt, you have more power on this area than in this area, so you also drive another thermal gradient. Now, what if you don't align things correctly? So this is a picture of the Alcator CMOD tokamak, which was in Boston. And they had an issue that in their divertor, a piece basically fell, so a tungsten tile fell, and didn't really matter. But what happened is when the plasma penetrated or hit the next block at full power and at normal incidence, and you see that you start melting everything. And very quickly they could not operate anymore. Every time they would start the plasma, this was melting, this was ejecting tungsten all over the place, and this will not move. So what you can see here is you have plenty of tiles with discontinuous edges and so on, and again everything has to be shaped to be protected. Now, if I take a piece of tungsten and I put it into a plasma, which is hydrogen and also hydrogen isotopes and helium, plenty of things can happen, and I won't go into the details, but that tells you that studying what tungsten does when it reacts with a fusion plasma can actually make a lot of papers, and I've made most of my career actually studying what happens to tungsten. So there are so many effects that there are many things to study. And the funny one that I want to show you is helium. So helium is created by the fusion reaction. You have bombardment of helium ions onto your surfaces. And what is fascinating is that in principle, helium is not soluble in metals, at least in tungsten. So you don't have, the solubility limit is basically 0. You should not be able to put helium into tungsten, except that you have a very strong repulsion force between tungsten and helium. So when you put a helium atom in the lattice, helium will try to find a way, a site and a defect to actually minimize the repulsion it has between itself and the tungsten atoms around. And when it does that, it's actually extremely strongly trapped inside the metal. So you have very high trapping energy because the helium atom is very stable where it is. It's basically stabilized by all the repulsion forces. And when it does that, well, the next helium atom will actually do the same thing, come at the same place, and so on. They start aggregating. When the bubble or when the helium cluster is big enough, it starts pulling tungsten atoms out of the lattice, basically creating self-interstitials and basically growing inside bubbles. So when you have helium into a material, or at least tungsten, at low temperature, what you tend to see are nanoscopic bubbles. So I don't see whether you see them too well, but typically a few nanometers in diameter and created close to the surface. If you increase the temperature, basically your material starts to swell in the form of filaments which are growing out of the surface. So this is what you will see on the top. You see very tiny filaments which are like 20 nanometers in diameter, and they are growing in kind of a random way out of the surface. So this is not something which is deposited on top, but this is the helium making the surface swell and form those filaments. And the problem with that is that you can just take a wipe and basically wipe that away. So it's creating a lot of impurities into the plasma, or it could create a lot of impurities. If I go at higher temperatures, I form really high or large voids and holes into the surface. And I'm not showing that just to show you nice pictures, although I do, but also to see how strongly a surface can be modified. And then the last thing I'll say, because I think I'm a bit short in time, is in ITER, the plasma will be on for about 400 seconds, and then you will have to wait about half an hour for the thing to cool down and for being ready to make the next pulse. So you have a strong cycling of the surfaces, and basically every time you put heat onto the component, you have strong thermal gradients, and when you cool down, you heat again, and so on. So you have very strong cycling. And what we know is when you have that, at some point you could have cases where so this is a picture of those monoblocks I showed you, have a very big crack forming inside this block, which the engineers tend to call self-castellation, because the material basically cracks so that it accommodates the stress better, because then you don't have any issue anymore. And you see in some cases, so this is about 8 millimeter of thickness of tungsten, the crack has gone all the way through and close to the cooling tube. So this could be an issue for the cooling process, but also because what happens is then you have the two sides of the crack, and you can have a height difference, so misalignment between one side and the other, which can be up to 0.5 millimeter. And if you remember what I said earlier, we make a lot of work in trying to align all of those surfaces next to each other at 0.3 millimeter precision. So now, just by cracking the material, I create a leading edge, and then the plasma can come here and then melt everything. So this is something we don't want. And we found out that this was basically a problem due to recrystallization of tungsten, which starts typically at 1300 C. Because you are at high temperature for a large amount of time, the material starts recrystallizing. it becomes more ductile, and then you have exhaustion of ductility at some point because recrystallized tungsten is actually quite soft. And then you have a crack forming, and then it propagates inside the material. So first as a ductile failure, and then as a brittle failure. And then the last thing I will touch upon is these issues of instabilities. And typically, a plasma would be really nicely confined, but then sometimes what will happen is something like that. So if you have seen pictures of the sun with those big filaments falling around or just being expelled, well, on the sun, this is really slow, it takes a large amount of time. Well, we have the same thing, but like fast forward. So those things are happening at 10 times, 100 times per second. Every time they expel a few percent of the energy of the plasma in a millisecond. So you dump a lot of energy onto your materials for a very short amount of time, and then you do that quite a lot. So if you look at the temperature of your surface, you will see just the baseline temperature, and then you will see all those spikes on top of that. And of course, that is a lot of thermal cycling that you have to worry about, especially because the number of cycles, at least in ITER, is expected to be at least in the 10 million range. This is really a large amount of time where the material can be cycled. And what happens, and I won't go into the details, but you have a lot of cracking because you just have a continuous cooling and heating, and basically you form cracks, whether they are intergranular or transgranular. And if you go higher in power, then basically you could melt the surface. You can make like 100 or 200 microns of the material every time, and then you do that continuously. And basically, because you are in a plasma with strong magnetic fields and strong currents, while you have a liquid pool of material which is liquefied, solidified, and then it basically forms large shapes. You can see an example of a surface after only 100,000 pulses. And you see that we had a roughness of about 0.1 millimeter already, with a lot of melted islands on the material. And just last thing, which is perhaps interesting also to just realize is, as in any physical system, the boundaries of the system is defined by its boundaries. And it's also true in a fusion device. Basically, if you look at the amount of particles which are on the surfaces at any time during the plasma, this is much more particles than is inside the plasma. So as soon as you inject the gas, you create your plasma, a lot of particles get absorbed on the wall. And then this is typically 10 to 50 times more particles absorbed on the wall than inside the plasma, which means that if suddenly those particles get released, then they change the plasma behavior quite a lot. So this interaction between the plasma and the surface is actually driving most of the performances of the machine, which is quite amazing if you think of it. And I'll just finish with a quick quote from a physicist who actually did his PhD in Toronto, which typically says that the boundary edge, so the edge of the plasma, is where the stellar world of hot plasmas meets the earthly world of cold solids. And this is really the challenge of materials for fusion. So you are trying to put the material on the surface of the sun. And understanding the complex interaction of those two worlds is actually essential if we want to make a fusion reactor to work. Thank you for your attention. I hope I was not too long, and I'm of course available for any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Greg. Like, really interesting talk. I learned quite a bit, and it's really nice to see nice explanations and all the references they're doing it. So, Greg, I'll be getting some questions from our audience members, and maybe we go through some of them. So, first one now, once ITER is running successfully, what do you see as the next main material challenge facing the next generation of fusion projects?
So yeah, that's a good question. I haven't said it, but for example, using beryllium is going to be only ITER specific, because we know beryllium erodes too fast, so we know it's not ideal for a reactor. But the reason it was chosen is because it has a low atomic number, so it doesn't pollute the plasma too much, so it gives headroom for the plasma physicists to actually operate. The next challenge would be to actually use something like tungsten around the plasma, and we know it's very difficult because it has a lot of it brings a lot of impurities into the plasma. And the challenge will be to minimize the erosion of the material, because you don't want to change the full wall every 2 years or so, which is currently actually the plan for the first demonstration reactor. You have to change the inside components every 2 years, which you might imagine is pretty expensive. I can't give you the exact number, but just the divertor in ITER is a couple $100 million, so it's quite an expensive thing. And then also ITER doesn't creates a high flux of neutrons, but not many when you integrate over operation, because we don't operate a lot. And for a reactor, the challenge will be that you have a large number of DPAs, displacement per atoms, And that is a regime we don't know so much. We expect that a fusion reactor will have to go to about 100 dPAs, which is like 10 times higher than a fission reactor. So you have to have also account for that and how the materials will change. So as soon as we go to ITER and beyond, neutrons are going to be the big thing we have to deal with.
Thank you. Is there anything that can be done with coatings to address some of the surface issues while still taking advantage of the properties of the bulk material?
Interesting question, because actually my last slide about controlling the fact that the edge or the surface was actually controlling the whole plasma. That's how we actually cheat a bit and improve the plasma performances. So when we use graphite, for example, graphite is really good, but it's a sponge to oxygen and water. And we had a lot of issues because it also sucks a lot of hydrogen. So to try and control that, we basically applied a boron coating, very thin, a few hundred nanometers, and we were doing that like every week or so. So that we still have the properties of graphite and a thin coating. The problem is, in a reactor, you can't do that because the coating will just be eroding too fast. Some people think that we can just tailor the edge of the plasma so that we continuously deposit something at the edge, but it's not very easy. So in a reactor, that probably won't work, although it has been tried. So it's a nice question.
What is the amount of dPA in nuclear fusion, and how to avoid the fast decay of lifetime in fusion reactors? So also, does this activation of materials use lead to any issues during operation, or lead to any issues during operation, rather than just activate waste? Yeah. So quite a bit I could go through again.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so what is the amount of dPA in nuclear fusion, and how to avoid the fast decay of lifetime in fusion reactors? And then does this activation of materials lead to any issues during operation?
So as I said, you typically have about, we think in a working reactors, you'll go up to 100 dPAs or so it's really high. The advantage you have in a fusion reactor is you can separate the fuel from the material. So we limit the number of elements we use, but we limit the activation. Of course, you do always have some activation, but you can limit the formation of long-lived waste, for example. So this is something we have. But we do have a lot of decay and we do have a lot of radioactivity. When we are actually in a reactor, you will have to form your own tritium because tritium doesn't exist naturally on Earth, and Canada will never supply enough tritium for all the world if you have fusion reactors. So we have to use multipliers, for example. We have to make neutrons react with lithium to create tritium. So all those things we have to do, and that will activate the materials. But the thing is, so far, people are really clear that we have to avoid long-lived waste, and then we choose the materials so that they don't activate too much or don't go over the long-lived waste criteria. Sorry.
Do you think that a fusion will replace or kind of more complement existing renewable sources like wind and solar?
Well, first of all, it's a question of time scale, of course. So whenever you hear anybody say fusion and climate change in the same sentence, you should be very careful because the time scale just doesn't work. So you have to decarbonize electricity in the next 30 years, and fusion will only appear on the grid in 30 years. So if the first reactor, and that we plan in Europe, comes around 2050 on the grid, you have a deployment time and so on. So you arrive in a grid which is already decarbonized. I think, but not everybody would agree, of course, I think you will always need some baseload power. And this is what fusion, but fission also, of course, fusion will give you some baseload power so you can control the output. You are not dependent on the weather, and you can supply a baseload of electricity. So I think there will be always a room for it. But of course, if storage becomes so much efficient or people become more intelligent grids and so on, develop, that's a big question. I personally believe that if we give up completely on fission or nuclear, it's going to be very hard for fusion to come up later on because people will have to do without it anyway. So it's a question of what you want to have.
How long do you think it will be before fusion will be used in our energy mix? Something a little bit.
As I said, the joke is 30 years, and it's always like that. No, but more seriously, we are at an interesting point, and I think I saw a question on that. We are at an interesting point because ITER is being built now. It's supposed to start operation in 2025-ish, so it's getting close to operate. It will take about 10 years to go to full power, but it's still going to be real. And what you see, and there is actually a very good example in Canada, there are fusion companies starting, which think they can develop fusion much faster. Some of them I think they can, some of them I'm a bit more skeptical, but that's life. if they manage to do that, and if somebody managed to prove fusion in 2025, 2030, which is not impossible, then perhaps you could have a reactor in 2040 on the grid, but it's going to be one reactor, right? And then you have to start deploying it and so on. And also, a little critique I have for some of those companies is they forget one thing, is that fusion is still nuclear. So you still need to go through nuclear licensing. This is something your nuclear regulator has never seen. So you have to, I mean, this process takes time, and this is the time which is hard to compress also.
One other one I have is there consideration for resistance to earthquakes and strong weather events in the current construction of the reactors?
Yes, quite a lot. Do I have a picture to show you? ITER is built in the south of France, which is supposed to be a seismic area. And it's basically designed on, I don't have a picture. So yeah, it's designed to be resistant to a certain amount of earthquakes. And the way it's done is the same way it's done in nuclear reactors. So the machine is built on a big concrete slab, which is about 1.5 meter thick. The main building, so the CAMAC building, the tritium facility, and then the diagnostic building next to it are on the same platform, and everything is built on seismic pads. So which are basically big concrete pillars, which are 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. On top of it, you have 20 centimeters of elastomer, and then you put your slab onto it and you build on that. Which means that the main components, in case of an earthquake, don't move with respect to each other, and that makes that more resistant. And that is isolated completely from anything else around it when you operate.
I think that's all the questions that I received. I think Jordan, Danielle, if you have something else you want to ask.
Honestly, I thank you so much, Dr. de Temmerman.
And thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this talk as much as we did. Have a good day or evening or whatever time zone you might be in. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much again. Bye.